thanks for the invitation. It's great to be at the centre, and I hope what I've got to say is of some interest. It's of course historical stuff that I'm going to be talking about. I know nothing of what the Water Corporation's up to today, but I did want to talk to you a little bit about the sort of, well, the countdown, if you like, to desalination. There's actually nothing new about desalination in Western Australia, because this, in 1896, was the biggest desalination plant in the world. And it was at Coolgardie. It was called a condenser because it actually burnt trees and got salty water out of the ground and just distilled it, basically. And it produced 100,000 gallons a day. It cost 5 bob a gallon, apparently, and 5 bob was an awful lot of money. It's probably $100 or something. It was very, very expensive. 1896, that was the year when C.Y. O'Connor started building his pipeline over a four-year period. Since then, there hasn't been much in terms of desalination. There are some good examples in WA. For example, Robe River had a mechanical vapour compression plant, which I think they built in the 1960s and operated for some time, quite a big unit. And the Water Corps operated a unit at Denham, probably on about its fifth edition, but up in Shark Bay there's no fresh water, so that's always been the source up there, and there have been little ones around the place, but really nothing big. What have we been doing in the meantime? Well, we built pipelines. Okay, so this is the one that C.Y. O'Connor was building in 1896 or so. We built dams, of course, and we built a lot of those, and for many decades dams were the only source of water for Perth. And then starting in the late 60s we built more and more groundwater. By the year 2000 it had become a very, very major source, about perhaps more than 2/3 at times of the water that we were getting. And we'd run out of places to dam. If you come forward a century, if you come up to 1995, we actually produced a big 50-year plan in 95. It was called Perth Water Future. So it looked out to the year 2050, and it had a combination of different water sources, more dams, more groundwater, more recycling, more demand management, and so on. It did list desalination as a possibility beyond about 2050, and it listed. It also considered things like towing icebergs and rainwater tanks. It was a serious plan, a very good plan. This is the graph of the stream flows from 1911. 1995 was the year in which we produced that Perth Water Future report and looked ahead. And it actually shows, when you look at it closely, that from about 75 to 95, the stream flow, the runoff into the dams, was only about half what it had been for the previous 60 odd years, 70 years. And so we seem to be on some sort of a hell of a decline. And we took the Perth Water Future Plan and had a closer look at this trend. We actually held a big seminar in 1996 with experts from North America and CSIRO, and we realized that the climate was changing, and that this could well be a permanent trend, and so we'd better get our skates on. I mean, this is stream flow. If you look at a rainfall graph of WA, it's nothing like this. It's not nearly as sort of dramatic a decline, and the reason is that what we get in the dams was only ever about 2 or 3% of the water that falls on the catchments. The rest gets soaked up by the gravel, sucked up by the gum trees, which are really quite efficient at taking the last molecule out of the soil, and so the runoff is just what's left, and so you could easily get down to zero, given that the bauxite up there, the gravel, is just blotting paper, and the gum trees are still there, and so it was a fairly scary scenario. So on the basis of that, we actually started in '96 an accelerated source program. And we built 3 new dams, one big one and a couple of small pipehead or pump back type dams, and we expanded groundwater a lot up to the year 2000. One thing we actually did though was in 1999 we produced we actually decided to have a closer look at desalination to see if it really was something that wouldn't happen out beyond 2050. I guess we were aware that desalination technology was improving. We did a deal with the Scottish desalination company. We did a staff exchange. Gary Crisp is here. He was the one we sent over, and one of their people came and joined us, and we actually produced a report in the year 2000 about the prospects for desalination in Western Australia. So that was quite a good study. It recalibrated our thinking, made us more aware. And the last one is the year 2001. That was, I call it the winter from hell. And actually Jeff Gallop, his government had just been elected in that year. So here's a brand new premier and a winter from hell. We'd always consider the most pessimistic of the options. We'd also consider a medium and a high one, but because you can't actually run a city without drinking water, we had to consider the most pessimistic one and make that sort of our base case for the future, and keep our fingers crossed and hope it didn't happen, but we had to be prepared for it to happen. We had to be prepared to continue to supply drinking water and washing water, even if we let all the gardens die through some sort of extreme water restrictions. So our planning then, that year, said, well, 2001, the winter from hell, let's say we have 3 or 4 more of those winters, what's our situation? And the answer was, if you had more than 2 more of those winters after 2001, then you actually ran out of drinking water. You would have got really low on in-house water. You know, you would long since have gotten rid of the gardens, and we were in dire straits. We got through the winter of 2001, and by the 3rd week of July, it still hadn't rained, and it was just the worst possible scenario. We'd never predicted that we could have a year that bad. I suppose we had, but that was the worst we could ever have had. So we decided to develop 2 new sources, because you can often lose one for environmental reasons or for political reasons, that kind of thing. We developed 2. One was a groundwater, a Yarragadee aquifer development from north of Perth at 30 gigalitres a year, and the other was a desalination plant. And I can remember my deputy at the time, a man called Gary Mike, who's unfortunately no longer with us, but I can remember he said to me in September of that year, look, Jim, the 2 sources we're developing are these 2. And he said, if we hadn't done that work on desalination, produced that report in 1990 and 1999 to 2000, the one in which Gary Crisp was instrumentally involved, then we wouldn't have had the knowledge, we wouldn't have had the confidence to know that desalination could be one of those options. We eventually proved that the groundwater option, only half of it was feasible, and we went ahead and did that. So we got 15 gigalitres of extra groundwater, and meanwhile we developed the desalination proposal, and we went ahead, and by December that year, 2001, we'd gone to the international market, and by the middle of 2002, we'd actually shortlisted 2 companies. We had comprehensive proposals in, they'd prepared their proposals, and we paid them for preparing their proposals. You're paying for the tenders. We judged that that was the best way, and I'm convinced it was. And we had them ready to roll by mid-2002. What I'm talking about, therefore, was the ability to hit the button on a desalination plant at a time and have it producing, cranking out the water 24 months later. And what we did then was we put it on hold. We wanted to see how the winter of 2002 unfolded, how the winter of 2003 unfolded, and so on. Because if they were good winters, wet ones, you know, Australia is a land of drought and flooding rain, right? So it goes up and down. We actually got these 2 proposals, and this was part of the deal, always the deal with the tenderers, and we put it on hold. We actually kept them on hold for 2 years, part of the deal. A lot of people don't realise that the original desalination plant, the one over here or wherever it is at Kwinana, was actually a contingency measure at the beginning, and then it became, eventually it became baseload. We had a little bit of recovery in about 2003, but really no recovery at all. That was just a continuation of that horrible trend down to 0. And so I can remember in July 2004, Jeff Gallop and I were talking about this, and I was briefing him on the situation, and he said, well, Jim, he said, let's do it. So there we are, we hit the button on building the Kwinana desalination plant. In the meantime, we'd actually bumped up the size of it by 50%, so it was now 45 gigalitres, not 30. But we had the 2 we'd had the two bids in. We selected the group. The French group was called Degremont, part of the Suez group, and the local partner was Multiplex. They were ready to go. They had the prices in for the key components and so on. And it went ahead, and the thing was built on time and on budget. So that was really a result of the tremendous amount of homework that had gone before. We finally hit the button on this desalination plant, and 2 years later it was built. Because of Perth's beautiful weather, normally they'll build a shed and put the desalination plant inside. In this case, we built the desalination plant and then built the shed over it. It was a pretty smart thing to do, actually. But one thing that we did, I was keen to do, was actually to keep it under wraps. It was being built at exactly the same time as the Mandurah railway line, Alana's railway line, and that railway line was being hit by all sorts of industrial strife. There were strikes all the time, and I didn't want the same thing to happen here. Now, the Kwinana Strip is sort of notorious for its not very good industrial relations record, but what we did in this case was we actually kept it out of sight. We didn't let any of the media go to it. We didn't have a sod turning ceremony, and I actually didn't go to see the thing myself until only a couple of months before we opened it. And really we wanted to keep it way under the radar and therefore not have it targeted. It was totally a union site. The unions had their offices on site. There was no attempt to exclude anybody, but because we gave it a low profile, it didn't get targeted, and that's one of the reasons we got it through on time and on budget. I can remember once Jeff Gallup rang me and he said, Jim, can I take Bob Carr to have a look at the desalination plant? And I thought, oh Christ, this is going to be a career limiting probably. I said, Jeff, no. I said, because I said to him, Jeff, we're going to finish this thing on time and on budget. And part of the reason is that we've just kept it totally out of the press, totally out, it's not a spectacle at all. And I said, and by the way, I haven't been there myself yet. I said, if I take you and Bob Carr down there, everyone's got to want to go down there, the press will know all about it, and I can't keep my promise to you about on time, on budget. So anyway, so he respected that. But they couldn't have a go at us in the media, they couldn't have a go at us at all, really. And in November 2006, Alan Carpenter was by then the Premier, and so he found himself down there in November 06 sipping a glass of this wonderful desalinated water, and the plant was away. So it was a great success, and I think everybody was very, very pleased with the result. In a way, I think we made the first desalination plant look too easy, and I think keeping it out of sight while it was being built was part of that. And so I think we made it look too easy. The other thing that happened was from about late 95 onwards, the other side of Australia turned to a crisp. I mean, they just ran out of water. And it was panic stations all round. They hadn't planned all that well, in my view, but when Alan Carpenter was on TV sipping that glass of water, suddenly the sky was filled with planes full of politicians from the east coming over and asking our people, our politicians, how the hell do you get one of those in 24 months? And so our politicians felt like heroes, and they, oh, well, that was easy, wasn't it? And of course, you can't actually build one of those in 24 months because you've got to do at least 24 months of homework before you start the clock running. The rest of Australia has also gone into desalination. Every other state except Tasmania has gone into desalination in quite a big way. One of the things that's different, it's not fashionable now to have a great big monopoly running a thing like electricity or water or any of that sort of thing. The trend from the mid-90s onwards was to break things up, and Western Power is a good example of that. In some states, the water supply was already pretty fragmented. In some states, like Queensland, it was all done pretty much on a local government basis. And in Victoria, more recently, it's been a regional basis. But here, we still have a monopoly of the Water Corporation handling most of the state, not all of it, but most of it, water and wastewater. And although that's sort of not fashionable and indefensible in the eyes of some economists and some politicians, I guess, when the going gets tough, accountability is 1,000,000% clear. There's what I call one bump to kick, and that's the person who's running the Water Corporation, and they know it, and so you've actually got to plan for the very worst contingencies. And I think that, in a way, helped us a lot. It helped us gain political influence and political trust. We had to be trusted. That was fundamental. And I think that model has stood WA in good stead and kept us well ahead of the rest of Australia. Another thing I'd mention, that's our use of alliance contracting. It's a new contractual relationship where you basically pool your teams of people, the water corporations, experts, and the contractors, the different contractors in a consortium and consultants, and you actually incentivise the whole group to maximise performance against a set of pre-agreed criteria, and rewards are dished out accordingly, and pain and gain. But that's a model which I think the Water Corp actually leads Australia in, and both the desalination plants are excellent examples of that, even though the private sector partners weren't necessarily accustomed to that way of operating. It has been very successful, and the feedback I've always had from those parties has been nothing but positive. So I think that's, both those plants on time and on budget, and that's something you won't read about in the West, but believe me, it's true. Thanks very much.